Hello, Harold Pollack. How you doing?
I'm doing great. That was quite a rapid snap count there.
We are doing the Glenn Show, and we've been doing it for years, so we're used to it in a very relaxed way on New Year's Day. 2017, Harold Pollack of the School of Social Service Administration of the University of Chicago, and I'm Glenn Loury of the Glenn Show, blogheads.tv, and also at Brown University. So we are here. It's less than 3 weeks to the inauguration. Of course, we have to discuss Trumpism, the implications of this historical moment. What must decent people do? Not to preempt Harold's soliloquy to that effect, but get ready for it, audience, get ready for it. And we have to discuss Obama, the great Barack Hussein Obama, who is exiting after 8 years as president of the United States. And so on. Harold, I'm turning it over to you. What then must we do? I think that's in Tolstoy or something like that. What do you do in the face of poverty? What do you do in the face of great moral challenge? Is this a moment of great moral challenge for the country? After all, it was a duly constituted election, and it came out the way that it did. The people have spoken through the Electoral College, etc., ad nauseum. Harold, what do you think?
Well, I think his election has permanently harmed the country, and he was duly elected. He was not one of the people who was challenging the mechanics of the election, but I think the moral legitimacy of the election is another question.
Moral legitimacy of the election. Come on, let's dwell on that for a moment. I thought it was 270 electors in the Electoral College that determined the legitimacy of the election. I mean, are you suggesting large-scale voter fraud or something of that kind?
No. I'm saying that the content of his political message undermined the moral legitimacy of his victory. It does not undermine the legal legitimacy of his victory. He is the president. He does have the legal levers of those things which he did win. But the disgraceful way in which he conducted it, and the way that he really, to me, the challenge, initiating the campaign by challenging the birth certificate of President Obama and the various racially incendiary comments that he made were efforts to litigate some principles of a pluralist democracy that I regard as bedrock. And it doesn't mean that he's not the president, but it does mean that I regard him in a fundamentally different way than I regarded George W. Bush.
Okay, that's all in the first person. Can we get to the third person? I mean, you're telling me how you feel, and I respect that. But what do we know that's true about the morality of anything? I question in a very deep way, with great respect to you, my friend Harold Pollack, the superficiality, again, with respect, I think, in the moral reasoning that draws that conclusion in a democracy. So a campaign is many things. It is performance. It's performative. A campaign is what it is. Okay, I'm not... I hate to be in this position. I'm always in this position because I feel like I'm the only person who's, not awash in emotion. Again, with respect, please forgive me, and you have ample opportunity to rebut.
I would know which of us at the moment seems more calm, but you may continue.
Oh, stop it. That's my affect, man. Come on, don't. I'm talking about the content of the argument. Okay, so here's what I'm saying. I'm saying the campaign was what it was. Okay? Judge Curiel was what he was. Your birther thing was what it was. P.T. Barnum is president, goddammit. I mean, yes, that tells us something about America, and in our leisure, in our dotage, we can write novels about it, okay? But the idea that the legitimacy of this monumental process of constituting a government over 300 million people, which is a cherished thing over centuries, is somehow morally undermined by the fact that P.T. Barnum ran a cartoon-esque campaign offends my ethical sensibilities.
It's a fact. It seems to me that it's just a fact about what happened.
I'll finish in a moment because there were certain key issues. Make America great again. I want you to tell me why that's morally wrong. Okay? I want you to tell me what's morally wrong about wanting to enforce a border. Please don't get mad at me. I want to know what's morally wrong about the content of the campaign. I want to know what's morally wrong about rebuilding the military and taking care of our veterans. What's morally wrong about fixing the inner cities? What's morally wrong about standing with the police? Harold, a majority through the Electoral College of your fellow citizens have constituted a government. The campaign was not a test of Donald Trump's character. It was an engagement on fundamental political matters. Now, if you're going to repair to the morally supercilious, again, with great respect, posture, that because you disagree with his policies, the government is illegitimate, I beg to differ.
Well, I think that the word illegitimate has several different meanings. And do I question the legality of his win? No, I don't. He won. He won we have an electoral college. Whatever one thinks of that system, he won under the system that we have, and he is entitled to be president. The manner in which he won, in many ways, and the character that he displays in almost every dimension. I mean, it's sort of as a combination of George Wallace and Henry Wallace, and add to it P.T. Barnum. I'm sort of stunned that so many of my fellow citizens chose to vote for him. But it is in my mind, the way that he won and the way that he departed in many ways from normal politics suggests that implacable opposition to him, in some ways taken from the Republican playbook that they used against President Obama, is the right course. And I think, by the way, as his shambolic transition is playing out, I think many, many Democrats and Republicans will join me in that. I mean, the more way I'm actually not a person. I wrote all this civil disobedience stuff before the Putin stuff came out, and although it was pretty obvious that what was going on during the campaign, we have a president who's taking office, with unparalleled unpopularity, with unparalleled questions about his personal ethics, about his financial dealings. And it's one thing to say, you mentioned a bunch of policy issues. Let me get to the list that you mentioned. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, actually.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was only going to make the point that what you had just said about a person assuming the office with various questions about their character and their legal status would have happened no matter who won the election. That was my intervention. But forgive me, you were not done, and I want you to have ample time to make your points.
Well, I see Hillary Clinton, and I know you and I both have a lot of respect for Hillary Clinton. I see her as a flawed, normal candidate in American politics. She gave some overpriced speeches at Goldman Sachs. She screwed up her email server. She came to exemplify a kind of establishment status quo that many Americans did not like. And so, and that was horribly costly to her as the presidential campaign turned out. Obviously, if 80,000 people had voted differently, we would be having a totally different conversation right now.
Can I make an observation?
But that's what it was.
About Hillary Clinton, this is kind of a side point from the Trump thing.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, she lacked the spark that would inspire people behind what was a profoundly historical opportunity in terms of her being the first woman to ascend to the presidency. She didn't, with respect, and how you say this with respect, rise to the occasion. And there were these various things that happened, but at the end of the day, she was outperformed. She was beaten in that election.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And in fact, I think the failure of our... Did you finish?
No, I was intervening on you. Go ahead. I want to come back to the issue of Trump and the moral moment, and you were expositing your views on that.
Well, by the way, I would say on the weakness of Hillary Clinton as a candidate, I think what this race really exposed is the vulnerability of our system, where you had a vulnerable candidate and a charismatic authoritarian candidate who has very dubious characteristics, and all of the gatekeeping elite processes that are supposed to keep someone, by supposed I don't mean in a moral sense, but I mean in the sense that we had assumed before the 2016 campaign. I think we had assumed there were a set of gatekeeping elites and institutions that would make it very difficult for someone as disgraceful as Donald Trump to get through the nominating process or to win election. Someone who didn't release his taxes, on and on, all the list of things. I mean, he accused one of his rivals, of his father, of conspiring in the Kennedy assassination. This is bizarre.
My God, the campaign is over.
Let me finish.
Get a grip, man. The campaign is over.
No, well, let me say what concerns me from an institutional perspective is we had assumed in many ways across the political spectrum that there's a set of processes within the political parties and between the political parties that when someone this far outside of what's appropriate,
I'm sorry.
And so you're right. Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate in these respects, and that is precisely when the institutions are most important. Because she would not be president today if a whole bunch of things had not happened, where a bunch of people in positions to say no, this is unacceptable had stepped up, and none of them did, and they were all, I think, hoping. By the way, I mean, I have a friend who's a.
Hold on, don't go to something else. Wait a minute.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's not lose track of the conversation because I need to speak.
Go ahead.
The institutions failed us because such a ridiculous candidate actually ended up prevailing, both in the nominating process and then in the general election. That was your thesis.
Yeah.
So I want to partly agree with it in so far as saying that the outcome which has happened, that this unlikely candidate has ascended, ought to occasion deep reflection on process. Okay, I'll go that far with you. I will say it's unusual. I would say it's contrary to what one would have predicted and perhaps contrary to what one would desire. I'm prepared to entertain that abstract hypothesis, though I regard it as not especially relevant at the moment. But in any case...
How can it not be relevant? This ridiculous character is becoming president in 3 weeks.
No. Well, I'm going to get to that. The duly constituted process, both of nominating, I mean, what's the status of the Republican Party? Well, it's now a Trump party. So whatever death throes it was in that allowed it not to be able to stop Donald Trump from getting its nomination are irrelevant because it's now a completely different animal, and we can start analyzing it. I don't know enough to have a full-blown theory about the Republican Party, but I believe that the tables have been completely wiped clean, and it's a brand new day over there. As for the Democrats, it would appear to be obvious that you or we don't have a message sufficient to win the election. I mean, we can go down to the 98,000, blah, blah. We can get to the mechanics. I know.
No, we lost.
I'd rather
no
not.
Question.
I'd rather not. Rather not. I would rather take note of the fact that most of the country is red. Most of the state legislators in this country are red. Most of the members of the federal Congress are red. Most of the people getting ready to get appointed to the judiciary are going to be red. Most of, etc. The administration of the welfare state is going to be pink. It's going to have a red tinge to it. The tectonic plates are fucking shifting, excuse me, okay? They are shifting, okay? Obamacare was enacted without a single Republican vote. I know you're an expert. I'm not trying to be against Obamacare. I'm trying to say that President Obama presided over the decimation of the Democratic Party, okay? I'm trying to say that there are a dozen things that the Democrats are on the wrong side of vis-a-vis the contemporary center of American politics. That's why they lost. We lost. Okay? Now, lamenting that is a waste of time, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. Lamenting it is a waste of time. Taking a good long look at it and thinking hard about it ought to occasion people right now. The president went out and begged people to vote for his legacy, including his own people, and they failed to do so, Harold, in numbers sufficient to produce an outcome that we all know could have been produced. They're not the only ones. I don't want to be misunderstood. It's a deep problem, okay? Now, we can parse it. There's some parts of it that are, I think, glaringly obvious. Political correctness, okay? Cops get murdered, and you have to flip a coin to figure out where people stand? So one candidate stands up and he says, I'm with the cops. Okay? The other candidate stands up and mumbles something different.
By the way, let me say...
I'm just giving it as one example of many that I could give.
Yeah, let me interrupt for 1 second about the film. There's something that's reflecting off of your monitor that is... you have to shift. There's a sun shining on you or something. That's much better.
Okay,
thanks
very much
for
detecting that. Thank you. No problem with the interruption because I know I was sermonizing, okay? about the fact that the election is indicative of a rejection at a profound level of much that contemporary liberalism takes for granted. Okay, and it strips away the pretense that the high-minded intellectuality and presumed historical wisdom attendant to the cognoscenti, who in the first instance anointed Barack Obama as the guy who's going to stop the oceans from rising, okay, and now must deal with the bitter fruit of a reaction. All right, this kind of thing is going on all over the world. You're going to paint it as Nazis. You're sticking your head in the sand, okay? The sky is not falling. The tectonic plates, however, are shifting.
Well, let me say a couple things in response to that. I do think that I agree with you that the way that we practice politics and the way that we engage people, we being Democrats, progressives, deserves a very hard look by the way, it's a look which in some ways says we've been too progressive, in some ways that we've been not progressive enough. I mean, it's not a kind of issue where the answer is we have to move to the center or move away from the center. It's a more granular thing than that. I agree with you that we have gratuitously alienated segments of America, in part through bad tactics and in part in a deeper way. I mean, when I think of my in-laws in Oneonta, New York, and them watching the Democratic Convention and the way that my party, the way that we approached the country in 2016, and I say, what would they have seen that would have said to them, we're reaching out to you. We are reaching out to you and really are trying to improve your life and value you. Now, there was a lot of policy that Clinton proposed that actually was very good for a lot of white working class people. I mean, a third of the newly insured people in Obamacare are white people with less than a college education, and quite a large number of them, by the way, in battleground states. Many of them voted for Trump. There's a set of policy questions, but when I just look at what would she have seen in the Democratic Convention, what would she have seen in the political messaging, ironically, my in-laws would have seen much more from Barack Obama than they saw from Hillary Clinton. Obama had a much less racialized campaign, in part because he didn't have to do that to keep the African American community. He already had it. And I think that I'm ashamed that we didn't find a creative way. My in-laws took care of I don't think they would have voted in this election. And here they were. They took care of an intellectually disabled person for 38 years. And I just don't think they would have seen much in the political messaging that's out there that would have brought them. So that's one thing. I think that I agree with you that we have allowed the state, everything except for the presidency is too boring for Democrats to really focus on, apparently. I mean, we have really neglected, and I do think that President Obama is never extended his branding beyond himself in dealing with a lot of those issues. We have clearly failed. You're right, a lot of the map is red. Now, I think, by the way, the counterpunching to Trump, a lot of that's going to turn blue again. I think that it's going to swing back, I think. And ironically, we have a lot of opportunities because they do own everything now. And that's going to create their own political problems. Of course. Go ahead.
I think that is the inevitably a stabilizing force. The people who gain more power also gain more responsibility and are exposed to failure to perform that responsibility. Yep. But I want to say a couple of things. I want to say something about Trump and the resist Trump, the worst guy that's ever got in the office thing. And I'm against that posture. I say, as it were, give Trump a chance. I know people are going to get mad at me. I don't care. That's basically, without mincing words, where I want to come out. And I'll say why. And then the other thing is about this, why do they vote against their interest, or what would the whatever be? Because I think it's very complicated. And about Obama, you say he had a lock on the black vote, so he didn't have to do what Hillary did to lose whatever. And I think that's exactly wrong. It's almost backwards. Let me start with that, in fact.
Okay.
I think Obama should have burnt his political capital with black people so as to do a Bill Clinton-like maneuver in the age of Black Lives Matter. I think a tremendous political opportunity for the Democratic Party was missed. It would have been extremely painful for him to do, but it would have been true statesmanship on a historic level. Obama missed his chance to be Lincoln in a very deeply ironic way. People are going to get very mad at me about this, but let me just make the point.
But so, you're once again spectral. You gotta close whatever your shade is. Yeah.
I got all the shades closed I can. I'm just gonna have to keep it just as the sun moves. Thanks for making me aware of this. Okay, so here's the deal. The deal is law enforcement, race, killings, and a movement starts. Ferguson, Missouri, civil disorder, Baltimore, trials of police, assassinated police officers. Okay, martyrs to police abuse and excess. A movement. Now, here's the president. He's a black president. He had an opportunity to define the character of race relations in a very profound and healthy way by repudiating, rather than embracing, the central narrative of African American victimization, and instead, as a black man, standing with the rule of law first and foremost. He should have been a pro-cop black president. I'm sorry, but that's where my thinking leads me. I know it would have been enormously painful to the African American community and to many people who were close to him, but a historic opportunity was missed because the sentiment and animating forces behind this movement are off base, Harold. They're wrong-headed, okay? I know we're going to have to debate this, and I know it's more than we can take up in one conversation, but I'm just trying to make my point. The president, from Henry Louis Gates Jr. onward, failed to manage the delicate thing. Ta-Nehisi Coates says he walked on ice and he didn't slip. He's fucking wrong, excuse me. He's absolutely wrong. The president fell flat on his face with respect to these issues. An historic opportunity was missed to reorient the conversation. Let me give one more example. All of this absolutely ridiculous condemnation of the president for calling attention to behavioral dysfunction and social irresponsibility in the black community. The idea that it could be a priori refuted, that would be a part of national leadership, when you and I both know that it's a central part, not the only part by any means, of leadership on this issue. He was black, and he had the megaphone. He had to change the conversation. He didn't do it. Okay, now let me just finish. It cost Hillary Clinton the election. Okay? All of this stuff about birtherism, let Donald Trump be the biggest fraud in the world. Okay? Repairing to that racism account of everything was a huge error. It was a fundamental error. It equivocated. It was feckless. It failed to lead. It was leading from behind. It was exactly the opposite of leadership.
Well, let me make a couple comments.
But I mean, I really want to get this point across because I think that people are absolutely wrong about it. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates is absolutely wrong about it. The president could not be a pro-black president. That was politically infeasible. It was simply not doable. Okay, the constraints are what they are. You're going to blame those people for being the constraints? That's ridiculous. That's ludicrous. It's ahistorical. It's ignorant. You cannot blame those people for being white. What an absurdity. Okay? Now, I want to live in the real world. I want to live in the real world, not a world where I pat myself on the back for feeling good about sneering down my moral nose at people rather than grasping the central facts of our political moment. Please refute what I've said. I want you to refute it.
Well, let me make a couple comments. Well, first of all, about Black Lives Matter, I actually thought that I do think that as you know, I've written about Black Lives Matter, and I've talked to some people that are involved in Black Lives Matter, which is a grassroots sprawling thing. One of the challenges
I'm talking about the whole ideology and the whole moment. It's in the academy. It's in the discourse of the Democratic Party. It's in the entertainment and the media and so forth and so on.
Well, so I always thought that Moral Mondays was the right model for dealing with many of the issues that people involved with Black Lives Matter were concerned about, and that Moral Mondays has been infinitely more politically effective in pursuing, in linking issues. I thought that the Black Lives Matter movement should have picked up issues like the rejection of Medicaid expansion and brought in people of different ages and broadened it from police misconduct to a series of public policies that were less polarizing, but that were, if you believe Black Lives Matter, the fact that the government of Alabama rejects health care for millions of its older African American citizens when the federal government is paying for virtually the entire cost, paid to public sector hospitals and so on, that's a Black Lives Matter issue. And I must say that I do think that did hurt, that did hurt the Democrats. And I must say, I never got too far in these conversations, and I basically felt when I talked to police about the rhetoric that police unions use, and when I talked to BLM folks about the rhetoric that BLM folks use, I failed the identity vouching test, and I got nowhere. And I think one of the things that we have to do moving forward is, I do think that Black Lives Matter folks have to look at the way that they are practicing politics and say, we are in fact harming the broader progressive coalition in some specific ways that we can address. And we have not that we should back off of the grievances that we regard as core, but we have to think about how do we do this differently in light of what's happening. And I do think that I am in a implacable resistance to Trump mode, but part of what that has to be is a very unsentimental assessment of, okay, this is the progressive alliance that we have. How do we get more allies, and how do we become better allies for the people that we need to embrace? And everything, and I think from the right wing for the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, that means we have to be more distant from Wall Street than is comfortable for a lot of the people that move in the Clinton orbit. And I think on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, it means how do we think and talk and engage people in a different way? Because I do think there's some validity in what you're saying about the way that BLM fostered a kind of backlash politics, which I actually agree with a lot of the core grievances that the BLM people talk about. But I do think that the way that they went about it and that they are going about it always created the potential. I'll give you an example of a lost opportunity. When the police officers were assassinated, which certainly was not directly, no one in BLM was directly culpable for that in any way. But that was a huge missed opportunity for the leaders of that movement to go to the homes. And some of that was done, by the way. And I do think that the people, there's a huge, the adversaries of BLM have caricatured what a lot of these people are about. There was a lot of very humane behavior towards the police victims of violence in Dallas that's not part of the narrative. But I do think that in a much more creative and public way, the BLM people could have embraced the victims of those crimes, the police victims, and said, this has nothing to do with what we're about.
Do you know who Jackie Lacey is?
I do, although I would fail a pop quiz to go into detail about her.
Okay, so she's the first African-American to be elected district attorney in Los Angeles County.
Oh, yes, of course, yes, I've actually met her.
She's responsible for deciding whether or not to bring charges against police officers who were involved in fatal shootings. Mm-hmm. She's catching hell from the black community out there, including local Black Lives Matter affiliated people, for not indicting officers under fact circumstances that she thinks doesn't warrant there to be indicted. And so there's a question about the community wanting justice and the inability of its black elected attorney general, a district attorney, to explain what justice actually consists in, which is applying the law under as best the facts can be constituted, and then arriving at the conclusions that she arrived at. Now, here's why I'm giving that example. It's not just Black Lives Matter It's not just this particular organizational form. It is a spirit of the times with respect to how to deal with the inescapable conflicts that arise out of the maintenance of order where the state has officers authorized to use deadly force. It has to be said, as Heather McDonald would remind us, and she's right to remind us, within the context of crime, within the context of the actual social circumstances in which these events are taking place. I'm not canceling anything out. I'm not balancing anything out. On the politics of the police officer public servant, yes, with a recalcitrant union, with an asshole union, of the police officer in the calculus, of the police officer public servant who is injected into situations of disorder and violence and encounters violent resistance, that in parsing the inevitable cases that are going to arise, the thumb would be on the scale this way or that, this way or that. That's the issue. That's the issue, okay? Now, Black Lives Matter is a part of this thing. I mean, we could try to trace it out as cultural historians. And your friend Ta-Nehisi Coates would figure in it, as would many other people. That's a part of this historical moment about how we're constructing a narrative to ourselves about all these questions of inequality, including disorder and violence on an epic scale in your home city of Chicago, for example. The country voted on that. There was an election, all right? I was trying to make the point, and I'm going to reiterate the point. The president could have altered the terms on which this particular issue is actually being adjudicated in our politics if he had been wiser and led from in front on the race issue by in some ways betraying the expectations of loyalty and fealty based upon racial identity about the matters that are of the most fundamental importance and concern to this country. Okay, so I want to reiterate, and I want you to tell me why I'm wrong. I think Obama's racial leadership failed us, and it failed us in exactly the opposite way of the way in which Ta-Nehisi Coates in his supposedly epic piece in The Atlantic, where my president was black, he attempts to expositate history, imagine the pretension, a history of the Obama presidency, exactly backwards to the way in which he construes it. Obama didn't split the difference with black people by having a few rappers in, but also giving speeches at Morehouse that offended Mr. Coates' sensibilities. Obama didn't do that. Obama failed the country by uttering such phrases as, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon, or by not standing firmly for law and order when American cities were burning.
I don't see. I'm sorry. Did you?
No, I'm done. I'm reiterating. I'm just reiterating because I really want that to be addressed. Am I right or wrong about that?
Well, there's so much there. I mean, I thought the Trayvon comment. I mean, Trayvon Martin was killed by a person who was not a law enforcement officer, but by a imbalanced vigilante who went on to have a whole series of other violent confrontations with other people, and Trayvon Martin is a whole different.
What it's about is that Obama didn't know the facts. A jury of his peers acquitted George Zimmerman for killing Trayvon Martin. Obama,
they didn't in any way justify. The jury said there was not sides. Let me talk, please. Let me just. Yeah. I mean, it's true that whether there was enough evidence to convict Zimmerman of murdering Trayvon Martin is one question. But it seems to me that the question of what to do about police conduct in their official duties is a very different question from a man chased down a 17-year-old African-American young man and killed him under terrible circumstances that may not have been provably criminal on the part of George Zimmerman, but which were quite appalling. And I thought the president's comments about Trayvon Martin, I personally found that to be, I did not find those objectionable. Now, the question of how to deal with the collapse of, let me say something about, let me just say the question of collapse of police legitimacy, which is partly here in Chicago, it seems to me we have such a tragic situation where we have, on the one hand, a collapse of police legitimacy, which was largely brought out by the release of videos which showed which showed police misconduct and then cover up of that misconduct on in a way that was just inescapable. At the same moment, we needed more aggressive policing in these same low-income African-American neighborhoods to deal with the gun issue, and where the police just don't have the legitimacy to, in some ways, do the thing that they need to do. And I don't know how we it seems to me that...
Well, I'm sorry, you're arguing at cross purposes. If the police legitimacy is a fundamental issue, then a movement whose raison d'etre is a condemnation of the police and a delegitimation of them is exactly what you don't need. And what am I missing?
Well, the problem is that the police have not earned that legitimacy that they need to do their job.
The legitimacy is not merely a product of what the police does. It's also a consequence of the leadership that comes from, amongst other places, the office of the President of the United States. And in particular, that comes from the people who are socially interacted with and legitimate on the ground in those communities. The legitimacy of the police is a jointly produced activity. The police, of course, are in Chicago are exactly what you say they are. They should be, quote, reformed, close quote, to whatever degree, and one can figure that out. But that's not the only thing that's going on. I was trying to say that the zeitgeist on racial issues that goes to the country after 50 years of post-civil rights development and lays at its feet the failures in African American society that are manifest, okay, and then re-prosecutes the civil rights movement, or Lord help us, the Civil War, as a way of dealing with that thing. That narrative is 30 years out of date, Harold. It was wrong in the mid-1980s, and it's definitely wrong in the 21st century. That's what I'm speaking to. That's the thing that Black Lives Matter and all the other boosters, where they make heroes out of people who are criminals, Harold. The default presumption is that the African-American person acting in violent conflict with the police is a victim. That's the default presumption, Harold. It's mistaken. It's an inaccurate characterization of what's going on.
Well, I must say I did not interpret President Obama's statements. I did not interpret what the Justice Department did in its involvements in Ferguson and other places as saying that. You know, for example, the Justice Department, Eric Holder, went to Ferguson and determined that Michael Brown was to a large extent in the wrong in the incident that led to his death. That was, and by the way, Ta-Nehisi Coates and many of the people that you criticize agreed with that assessment. Not fully, but noted that there was a proper investigation that had brought out the facts. So, I mean, I think President Obama presented a nuanced discussion of many of these points. Now, I think how it got filtered through the public conversation, whether he could have done it differently, is another question. I don't view him as offering in any way a full-throated endorsement of every attack on law enforcement. Many occasions.
I'm sorry, Harold. I have to ask you to hold up for a minute.
Okay.
Completing passes to Jesse James and Eli Rogers. With 13 seconds left, he fired to Antonio Brown, who made the catch and...
Looks like my football game is coming on over here, so my television started talking all by itself.
Well, I'm sorry but let me. Can we shift? Okay. I mean, I think we've gone over this ground, and I see.
Yeah, I just want to. I have a codicil. My codicil is. I don't want to, the full scope of my argument be lost amidst the weeds of a debate about this or that particular illustration of it, which was that the zeitgeist on racial issues for the country's health going forward into the 21st century needed to shift from the anachronistic civil rights racial bias claiming posture in which forces like structural racism and a presumed deep white entitlement, supremacy and oppression of black people is the major narrative, and that the president missed the historic opportunity to change that narrative by spending his political capital with African Americans rather than by, in effect, de facto husbanding it. Al Sharpton, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we could go on, and again, I don't want to get down in the weeds on this. And that's my position, okay? And I invite you, readers and everything, and let's move on to something else. I agree, there are other things. There are other things to talk about.
Well, let me give one very pessimistic lesson that I learned from my involvement in the Affordable Care Act, which relates to the election, which is, everything that we did in ACA that tried to make it a more politically moderate policy and that tried to make it a more fiscally responsible policy ended up exerting enormous political costs. I'm actually convinced that Hillary Clinton would be president today if we had just made ACA a bloated middle-class entitlement that had exploded the deficit and that gave middle-class people a better experience in the healthcare marketplaces, that didn't try to curb the cost of healthcare spending by putting in the Cadillac tax to try to curb, tax subsidies, that didn't anger various interest groups by trying to constrain Medicare spending. And one of the things that the defeat of Clintonism is many things, but one of the things that I really fear moving forward is the defeat of the idea that I think that one of the lessons that many people have taken from this is that good policy is often bad politics, and I do think. It is so ironic to me that many of the Trump voters who had one of the legitimate reasons to vote for Trump, legitimate, not that I embrace it, but legitimate that I totally understand, is people said, I was disappointed that I needed health insurance and it cost more money. I'm a middle-class person, and I went on this health insurance marketplace and the insurance was expensive. And I was expecting something better. And that was actually a lot of people in battleground states said that. And they didn't say it based on any propaganda. They said it based on their own tactile experience with this. And that tactile experience came from a couple of things that often reflected either compromises that we made to keep the cost of ACA down, to get conservative Democrats to sign on, or what happened to ACA because of Republican resistance to it that made it a lower quality product from the point of view of the people who interacted with it. And
okay.
And I find that so, Democrats the next time around, I think policy-wise will have a much more limited voice, for good or for ill, because I think that's what everybody who was involved in ACA came away thinking. And I just find that really sad that, if we had really, the things like being fiscally responsible, there's just no political advantage to doing that in any legislation. And that's just the reality as I experience it.
Can I just say, I'm listening to you lament, and, it could have been otherwise and so forth and so on. Tectonic plates are shifting and have shifted, and what are we going to do now? I don't know. The scale of the shifts is so staggering. So you could go down this cabinet list of what I imagine you would take to be horribles. Steve Mnuchin from Goldman Sachs and Wall Street is going to be the Secretary of Treasury.
Yeah, nothing says economic populism like a cabinet.
The chief executive of Exxon, ExxonMobil, is going to be the Secretary of State in all likelihood.
Yep.
Jeff Sessions of Alabama is going to be the Attorney General in all likelihood, and moreover, one of his ace boon coons could end up on the Supreme Court. I was just reading about this guy. I can't cite his name, but he's an Alabama federal judge, and he and Jeff Sessions and so forth and so on. The law enforcement apparatus is going to be completely changed. The head of the Labor Department is a guy that used to run a fast food franchise.
Yeah.
Okay? He's the head of the Labor Department, where people have been going around the country trying to build a movement out of a $15 an hour minimum wage. Guess where he stands on that? The head of the Environmental Protection Agency is the Attorney General of Oklahoma, who's in bed with the oil companies, and it's not clear that he feels the same fire in the belly about climate change that you might hope that the EPA chief administrator would feel.
Yes.
All of the congressional committees that oversee these agencies are chaired by Republicans in both houses. Man, there will be ample opportunity to lament, okay? The ground is being completely reshaped, and I do think it behooves us, and again, I use the first person plural with trepidation. I do think it behooves us to get serious about that real game. The one that we're actually in.
Let's talk about that.
The one that we're actually in.
So first of all, I think actually on ACA, by the way, there's a lot of opportunity for counterpunching because they do own everything, and because the reality is that although the Affordable Care Act is unpopular, its actual components are popular. And in fact, and they really run a serious risk of. People have said they're like the dog who caught the car. I think the better analogy is the bear who caught the car, because the bear can actually hurt the car. And, I think that it's actually very unclear what's going to happen to ACA because of that. I actually think on healthcare that it's very uncertain. I think they're going to do something that's going to officially repeal ACA. We know that. How much it's actually going to move with all these Republican governors worried about the on-the-ground consequences, I think that is very uncertain. What actually worries me the most is things where where the powers of the presidency are most specifically decisive. And here you have a list of people who sent. The DACA list is the most obvious thing, where you have these people. I have students at University of Chicago who are in their late 20s, and they've sent their names into ICE, and they've said, I'm an unauthorized immigrant, and here's my name and address, and I'm registering for DACA. And what's going to happen to those people? The IRS has never shared with ICE a lot of critical information. We have this weird compromise in immigration reform in America that sort of incompetent enforcement is kind of our political compromise. And so we've never used the tools of big data, for example, to their full effect to identify all of the people who are longstanding unauthorized immigrants, but we could. And that actually is much easier for the president-elect to do than it is to take away health insurance from 20 million people, which he might do, but which I think would generate such a political firestorm that I think that is a real worry for them, and it creates a lot of opportunities for people like me to resist it. When I think different issues create different opportunities, I think the fact that, go ahead.
I just want to weigh in. So here's how I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it that there are specific policy features, stipulations, rules, regulations, and so forth. And then there is the animating ideological set of commitments behind those policies. Okay, so they're values or whatever. So it's an ongoing dynamical system, so you can't just change stuff arbitrarily. So there's some stasis, there's some built-in hysteresis in the system that things are not going to like. People get benefits you can't just take them away from.
Yep.
So those are constraints on the process. However, when you have a shift in tectonic plates such as we've seen, whatever manipulations are taken which happen to go inside of those constraints, the counterpunching and all of what you say, will be animated by the pursuit of goals defined by those values that are very different from the values previously animating the rendering of the policy. I'm sure if I knew more about healthcare policy, I could give dozens of examples of where commitments to equality or for women or whatever the overarching liberal sort of valuations might have played, shaped the policy, affected the way in which the policy was actually rendered. And that's now going to be done on a different basis, with a different set of nuances, with a different set of compromises being made in a slightly different direction. And I think that's the thing that we're confronting, and I see it across many different areas. So, for example, climate. I want to be specific about what I think is wrong with the progressive rhetoric. So on climate. So the claim is people are deniers. The claim is people who approach the same set of constraints that we're talking about, including the science, okay? The science is one of the constraints that's ongoing.
I would hope, yeah.
Well, no, there's uncertainty. I mean, there's difference of interpretation. There's difference of weighting and evaluation. But in any case, it's a given. It's one of the things that's ongoing. There are just a lot of different ways of parsing this. The global negotiation about the sharing burden associated with a planetary enterprise is a delicate and interesting and profound thing. I'm sure trillions of dollars ride on it. I'm talking about U.S., China, India, how you parse it, how you cut it, what are the rules, what's the understandings. It's complicated. People can have different views about it. And the views that are going to be governing going forward are just going to be so very different. I'm not sure that that's in every instance a horrible thing. And in any case, it's the will of the people. And here's what I want to say.
Well, I will say I'm more optimistic than the assessment that you just gave, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But I'll let you finish.
Okay, because I want to get to this point about anti-Trumpism. I mean, sort of circling back.
Yeah.
I have really two problems with it. One of them is the implicit disrespect for the people who constituted the democratic basis of the electoral college majority that made Donald Trump president. Okay, so they won. Those people won. They got what they were voting for. The people who turned out at the rallies, the people who were enthusiastic, who wore these caps, they count too. Those people, their enthusiasms, their hopes, and their dreams matter also. Those dreams are not any less significant or less human or less virtuous or righteous than the dreams, the exhilaration of the crowds that swarmed around Barack Obama when he was elevated in 2008 to the presidency. The tears shed by people who wept in joy that Trump had been elected are no less valid human tears, expressing no less honorable emotions in those people.
I agree with you that the tears, by the way, that they're, as human beings, they're equally valuable. I do not believe that they are no less virtuous.
And I believe, we disagree about that, and I'm not finished. Because what I'm saying is, they won, okay? And a repudiation of their candidate is a repudiation of them, and that's one problem that I have. There's another problem. It's called respect for the office. Okay, now when Donald Trump was running a birther campaign, amongst the offenses, for those who were able to see past racism, for those who were able to understand that there are other things at stake besides whether or not some white person just did something to a black person, among the things that were being debased by that campaign was the office of the president. Mm-hmm. Okay? Same story now. Same story now. When that guy stood up in Congress and yelled out at President Obama during his State of the Union address, "You lie!" He committed a profound offense, not only against the president, a black president, so let's let him be a racist if you must. I don't know how you know, but whatever. More fundamentally important is he debased the currency of civility in the interaction of the government of the greatest country on the planet. He showed disrespect for the office. So a dismissal of Trump now that he has been elected president of the United States debases the office. Okay?
Well, let me say a couple of things about
respect. The fact that his daughter, for example, was yelled at by a bunch of yahoos on an airplane ought to have occasioned exactly the same amount of vitriol from the guardians of virtue as it would have occasioned if Barack Obama's family had been treated in that way. It was the same offense. It was exactly the same offense, Harold. This is what I'm saying. I'm saying liberals are screwed on the race issue. I'm back to making that point. But respect for the voter and respect for the office. Please address my concerns.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. One is civility and decorum. And I completely agree with you that one has to conduct oneself with civility and decorum. And I don't believe in. I believed it was a huge. I don't believe in shouting down Trump rallies. I don't believe in bothering any members of his family on an airplane. And I certainly think that one should behave in a way that is appropriate for. Partly because of our own conception of ourselves also. There is something that is self-debasing about that kind of behavior that I find that I think is not that is a separate point, but that is also something to be weighed. I think we need to carry ourselves with a kind of dignity that in politics all the time. Now, I think that one can be implacably opposed to someone in a dignified way and understand that you sit there politely at the State of the Union address without screaming at the person because he is the president. Now, having said that, I think there's two things. One is that from the jump, very effectively and successfully, Republicans went after President Obama they basically denied him a Supreme Court seat. Every implicit norm, the debt ceiling on down, they have profited by violating every implicit norm in legislative politics in America over, during the Obama years. And I totally feel. Well, hold on. You went on an exegesis, and now it's my turn. So I feel to the extent that these norms are norms that are contingent on the behavior of the opposing party, clearly Republicans have created a precedent for violating a lot of the implicit norms of American legislative politics. Also, I think that I just don't think that that President-elect Trump is a normal political figure, and I think the most appropriate response to him is a comprehensive repudiation and discrediting of him. From right now,
voters and his office. Please, can you? I understand that you don't like Trump. I'm asking you to address my argument. My argument was that you disrespect the voters who elected him, whose hopes weren't to be honored just as much as anybody else, and you debase the office.
Well, let me say first of all on his voters. By the way, comment. Of course, there were more voters who voted for Hillary Clinton than there were who voted for Donald Trump, and that is not. That's obviously not operative.
It's also irrelevant.
Well, it's not irrelevant for thinking about what about the dignity of those voters and the fact that he has done absolutely nothing since he's been elected to reach out.
That's a separate question.
He is really seeking to polarize the country, but I think you can. It's a complicated question how to think about Trump voters. By the way, it's so interesting on healthcare because so many of them said, I just don't believe he's going to take away my healthcare and so on. And I think a lot of the things that I would resist that Trump is trying to do and the Republicans are trying to do will get very substantial support among Trump voters. And very large numbers of Trump voters, by the way, said that they have very serious personal questions
let me tell you some things about
so I just don't feel that I'm disrespecting those people by
they are pro-life. I'm talking about Trump voters. They're pro-life, okay? They're pro-life, okay? They like the military.
I like the military.
At Brown University, there's a controversy about whether or not ROTC should be allowed to recruit on the campus. You might like the military.
By the way, I favor international conservative students also. We can talk about
between the attitudes of Trump voters who came out to those rallies and put on those caps and the people who would have elected Hillary Rodham Clinton if she had ran a more effective campaign, in terms of what they think about the military, is how does Trump put it? It's huge. It's huge. Okay? It's a really big difference, and it actually matters.
What's the big? I don't understand the big difference. I'm sorry. I just don't understand what you're... So you're saying that people
I'm talking about the military. I'm talking about the military. I'm talking about we're going to make America the most powerful country in the earth. I'm talking about the jingoistic of chest beating. I'm talking about we're going to take care of our veterans. I know everybody likes our veterans. This is a guy that ran a campaign on this.
It's completely, by the way, I should say, needless to say, he has a completely vacuous... I mean, Hillary Clinton, if you actually looked at who had some proposals to help veterans, you know that there's way more substance in what Hillary Clinton was talking about than...
So do you think that if you polled the average American and you asked them, who is more stronger pro-military during the campaign, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, they would have said Hillary Clinton? I don't. Well,
let me ask you this. We now have the weird specter that we have a president-elect and a secretary of state who are calling it... Well, president-elect. Let's stick with president-elect. Who is calling into question our fundamental NATO obligations and who benefited in some way, probably not decisively, but in some way, from the chicanery of the government of Russia.
Let him form a government. Let him form a government, and let's see what his policy is. And then we can discuss his foreign policy. You cannot discuss Trump's foreign policy before he has a foreign policy. Let him form a government, and let him implement a policy, and then we can discuss his policy. I think all of this in-trail reading is a waste of my time. It's a waste of time.
This is 17 intelligence agencies of the United States government which said that the government of Russia...
Let me tell you something else about Trump voters. The guy said that he was going to cut taxes across the board. People voted for that. Okay? They voted for the guy who said that he was going to raise tariffs on goods coming in from other countries. The guy who said that the Iran deal was the worst thing that ever happened and that Israel was going to be his friend until the end of time. They voted for him. These are Trump voters. I'm talking about the people who you say it's complicated to know what to think about.
Yeah.
These are people who think there should be a border. They fear having the composition and character of the country determined by the happenstance of a porous southern border, and they want to do something about it. Okay? They want to be respected. Their candidate won the election. Those views can be contested on a case-by-case basis. You say, what to do with the DACA people? The president of the United States created that out of whole cloth.
He did. Well, first of all, by the way,
that is not law beyond the will or prerogative of the executive who's administering the relative enforcement agencies. The issue needs to be actually, excuse me, let me just finish this. The issue needs to be litigated and resolved, and you know you have to do that with Trump voters. The way you get from where you are to where you want to be is by dealing with them. They want to be respected because they want to be respected because you are not clairvoyant. You don't have a pipeline into the moral truth. You can also learn something from these Trump voters. You should be listening to them.
I agree. I should be listening to them. And by the way, I think that I do very much plan to appeal to Trump voters because I think on many of the issues that you just mentioned, I think Trump voters agree with me much more than they agree with the policies that a Republican Congress is likely to try to come up with. One of the ironies in this, by the way, is I basically trust Speaker Ryan with the nuclear keys, and I basically trust the president-elect not to want to smash all of our entitlement programs that help poor people, but unfortunately the wrong man is in charge of each thing. And
that's very funny, Harold.
What's that?
I said, that's very funny. I get it. If only Ryan had the nuclear keys and Donald Trump were making social policy, we'd be in a better world. Listen, we're past an hour. I propose that we conclude. If you have final words, go ahead and say them. I will not try to rebut you.
No, I will. I think that talking to Trump voters is really important, and I'm sure learning from them. I have Trump voters in my family that I have not defriended on Facebook or anything like that.
Congratulations, Harold.
But I must say that I will be implacably opposed to these policies, and if they come for those DACA kids, I'm going to go to jail. And because I just think it's a fundamental injustice, and then I think, and that's one of the ways I'm going to speak to those Trump voters. I'm going to say to them, this is what I think about this issue.
Okay, I'm going to violate my rule. I regret that you would go to jail about the enforcement of the law. I really wish that you would rely on the rule of law to determine the status of people unauthorized to be in the country, and not believe that that is the appropriate site for some extra legal action on behalf of a fundamental moral principle. I do not think residency in the United States of America without authorization is a fundamental human right, the deprivation from which should occasion people laying their bodies down on the street. You have to persuade your fellow citizens about the law. You can't.
Well, that is one of my mechanisms of persuasion. This is not a civil rights issue.
That's a mistake. It's a mistake to claim that people who want to continue to reside in the United States, and please don't misunderstand me, I'm not advocating deporting them. I'm talking about the moral principles involved. It's a mistake to claim that people who desire to reside in the United States without authorization are entitled to do so.
Well, let's take one moment on this before we close, because this is meaningful to me, so I want to, if I may. So suppose that you have someone who's 28 years old. He's been in the United States since the age of 3. He's been, his parents have been doing scut work for the past 25 years, and he is now, he's a Chicagoan, and he's been twice to his birthplace in Mexico, maybe. And following a policy that was supported by George W. Bush, implicitly by Lindsey Graham, John McCain, Marco Rubio, a lot of other people, he proceeded on the assumption that through normal politics, his situation in the United States would eventually be regularized. He speaks English far better than he does Spanish. If he speaks Spanish, he probably does speak Spanish.
I've got it.
And now this question: this person could be deported. In my mind, Maybe he's a student at the University of Chicago. Maybe he's just a guy who, has a job. In my mind, that would be such a profoundly wrongful treatment of that person that in a transparent way, I want to say, if you're going to come for that person, I'm going to go chain myself to the door of that federal courthouse and say, I think this is wrong.
You've had opportunity to express yourself. Let me respond to this.
I think you should do that. I think everyone should do that.
Let me respond to this.
Yeah.
Okay? Because I believe what you're doing now is moral blackmail. I don't believe that it's fair argument at all. This person whom you describe does not, let's say on the hypothetical, have legal status to be in the country. Now, the question is, what are we going to do about that? All right? Acknowledging the fact that he does not have a right to be here does not decide the question of what we are to do about it. Okay? Now, it may be that inevitably, in the spectrum of the cases that arise, such as you are alluding to, there will be degrees of moral claim. Okay? Somebody is going to have to draw a line and adjudicate how that's done. These cases are going to have to be parsed. Yeah. The idea that we would simply look away and de facto regularize the status of someone who does not have legal authorization to be in the country shows contempt for the law.
Well, by the way, that's not what I...
Well, no, neither did I say that this person should be rounded up and deported. What I said was, whatever we're going to do has to be the consequence of persuasive interaction with our fellow citizens. The reason that the president's management of this particular problem is not going to hold up is because we never got it enacted into law. It was an administrative mandate, and those can change with the shifting wind. I too would object, in the circumstances that you described, to a cruel and inhumane system of legal administration that imposed upon this person whom you describe the awful circumstance of being deported to a country that they don't know. I too would object to that. That would be the wrong way to administer the law. I'm not at that point in raising the issue that I raised. And when I say losing the fight about the administration of the law, is a fight that has to be fought not from a moral high ground in which we make absolute declarations, but from the rough and tumble engagement with our fellow citizens about how to humanely administer the organs of our government.
Well, that's what I view myself as doing. First of all, by the way, this is not at all a hypothetical case. We have 35 or 40 students at the University of Chicago who are DACA students, many of whom are to one degree or another similar to the scenario that I just laid out. Okay. And obviously that's them, and of course they are the most privileged group of people, but there's hundreds of thousands of people who we have essentially invited here to do low wage work.
Okay, Harold, please.
But just to directly engage your thing, I'll get to you in a second. I don't regard it as moral blackmail. I regard it as saying I'm putting down a marker where I'm saying what I want from this is normal politics. And I think this is where the racial comments that President-elect Trump has made makes it different to me. I don't, George W. Bush, I completely would feel differently about.
Okay, I don't think we're making any progress, Harold. He's not a dictator. God, I'm talking about the Congress of the United States. It's got 535 members in it. For crying out loud. I'm saying we got an important political question in front of the character of this particular man, not irrelevant, but it's a third-order issue. I mean,
well, not in this issue where he has so much power. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go on.
We're done. Let me go. Okay. I have a life here. I got to get on to my life.
Okay.
All right, Harold Pollack. Round one of the postmortem. We did not really evaluate the president's tenure, 8 years in office. And perhaps that can be the subject of another conversation.
Yeah, that would have required a Fidel Castro-length disquisition, I suspect. There's a lot going on with that one. Hey, have a great new year, a happy and healthy one.
Thank you, Harold. To you as well. I'm glad you're my friend. It makes life interesting. Take care of yourself. I'm going to stop the recorder now.